Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for joining Insight Legal on this very warm Thursday for this latest webinar on AML and how to stay safe and compliant. And we'll talk about some guidance on your obligations as a law firm. My name is Josh Dallywell, and I'm one of two hosts on this call today. I'm kindly joined by my colleague Andy Butler for this next half an hour. Andy, many of who, certainly for those of you who are Insight Legal clients, will be familiar with as one of our product specialists. Andy's actually been with the firm for almost 9 years. Is that correct, Andy?
Yeah, a long time.
Excellent. Now, aside from joining me on this webinar, Andy will also be monitoring the chat and QA boxes on Zoom for your questions, and we'll be coming back to Andy on that later. It is worthwhile obviously mentioning at this point, if you're not already familiar with Zoom, that if you look out for the icons on the toolbar, you'll see the ones that allow you to share your thoughts and questions with Andy and I during this webinar. If we do run out of time for any other questions, we will reach out to the individuals directly whose questions we don't manage to cover. Okay, questions that are submitted through Zoom can only be seen by the panelists, so please feel free to ask in confidence. Alternatively, you can reach out to Andy or I directly with any questions, or webinars@insightlegal.co.uk, and we'll pick up as many of those during this session. I should also mention as well, this webinar is being recorded, so we will be making a copy available to everyone who has registered, and hopefully you'll get a link to that video on YouTube, either by the end of the day today, or certainly kind of by midday tomorrow, that everyone will get that email. Now, for the benefit of all of you joining, and certainly those who aren't already familiar with Insight, because I certainly see a fair few new names and new firm names that we're not obviously familiar with. Insight Legal is a legal software company, and we typically work with practice managers, finance managers, and senior partners in law firms, really kind of anywhere from sole practitioners to businesses of about 150 people. Although I think the latest word I hear, Andy, is that our largest client now has, I think they've added some additional users. They're now over 230 users. Okay. So what do we have in store for you today? We've got a kind of a fairly packed agenda for this kind of for this short slot. So we're going to try and crack on. We're going to look at obviously why there continues to be a focus on AML. We're also going to discuss the measures you need to ensure that you remain compliant as far as your obligations as a law firm are concerned, and really kind of what role technology can play in the reliability and constant of AML checks. Okay, and so ensuring a process is followed, and how you handle the documents and record what you have or haven't done for audit purposes. Okay, one thing that's obvious is that money laundering, is never really kind of been too far from the headlines. So really kind of anything from allegations from the Panama Papers to German betting shop scandals and cryptocurrencies to I think the latest one I read about was £100 million being shipped in suitcases to Dubai by hand. Really kind of kept AML firmly in the media spotlight, and that's often accompanied by stories of larger than life personalities, often with a fleet of Ferraris. Okay, but closer to home, you have obviously the financial challenges faced by law firms, both in a post-pandemic world and facing an ongoing Ukraine war, which is causing rising energy and living costs, and also the difficulty of recruiting staff. Okay, and one of the things that this does is it allows criminals to take advantage of the disruption and the economic downturn. Firms, I think in the last couple of years, have probably been more exposed than ever to the risk of being exposed to money laundering. In times of kind of economic uncertainty, usually the first roles at risk in law firms tend to be for those in support and admin, and these changes could reduce your ability to carry out compliant risk assessments, customer due diligence, and also source of funds checks. Okay, many firms will have found client due diligence, including appropriate levels of identification and verification, certainly more difficult because of, I guess, previous lockdowns and also social distancing. And we know that, changing from face-to-face to online communication exposed firms to different risks. Okay, so they needed different methods to control them. And criminals, as I mentioned, will take advantage of uncertainties and changing circumstances to deceive firms. Okay, and you kind of then throw into this mix the time pressures from home buyers and estate agents to meet certain deadlines, and with potentially a reduced number of staff, and you can see how mistakes, shortcuts, and oversights are made. Maybe not always with the intention of supporting criminal activity, but regardless of your intentions, any misconduct, negligence, or oversight is likely to be met with the same penalties by the SRA. And in terms of, I guess, some of the most recent data that we've seen from the SRA, now of the 69 firms visited in the year to April last year, only 24% were found to have AML procedures and processes in place that were deemed to be fully compliant. Okay, 12% were not compliant at all with AML regulations and were referred for investigation. I think in all, the SRA's AML team, I think, continually deals with about 200 investigations, which really range in sometimes straightforward non-cooperation by firms, right up to really complex investigations which relate to international fraud or terrorist financing. Property transactions are really the most common cause of investigation, and while some of the factors that have contributed to the need for enforcement action were not training or supervising fee earners and having inadequate policies, procedures, and controls, or individuals simply not following those procedures that were already in place. Out of 241 files reviewed by the SRA, 103 did not contain appropriate source of funds checks. Okay, so not only are you having to verify, or not only should you be verifying who your client is who they say they are, but again, appropriate source of funds checks are very important here. And nearly a quarter of firms did not have a source of funds policy. Now, you can look at that data and it doesn't make for great reading. I think something like more than 10% of law firms whose compliance with anti-money laundering rules was checked by the SRA in the last year have been referred for investigation. Okay. Now, in terms of, I guess, the SRA legislation on client due diligence, it broadly fits across 5 key areas where law firms usually fall foul of either partial compliance, or that they only check 1 or 2 of these boxes. And the first one is really the most basic client due diligence checks. And this will obviously involve confirming the identity of your client, which basically means verifying who they say they are. And this is usually through a new client providing some kind of photographic identity, whether that be through a passport or driver's license. And really, again, I think in a post-pandemic world, with COVID restrictions that were previously in place, I think firms were often quite happy for, I guess, their clients to submit scans of documents or pictures of documents from their phone. And obviously, I think you have to continue to look at what risks those pose. I guess I use an example of my own actually recently. I hired a van recently, and obviously that's not something that's not one of the most complex of transactions, but as part of that hiring process, I needed to show up with my driver's license and a recent utility bill. Now I'm reasonably tech savvy and being conscious of my environmental footprint. I do all of my banking via an app. My electricity, water, and my Virgin Media bills come to me by email, or I have to log onto a portal to download them. However, kind of sitting in the reception at my local van hire place, I was conscious that I'd printed out my bills, and kind of partway through page 2, the printer started to struggle. And that's not a new story for anyone, I imagine. And there are a few streaky lines across the page. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, there's no way this guy is going to let me hire a van with this streaky printed utility bill. And to be honest with you, that is sometimes that is as far as some firms go, as far in checking whether kind of certainly kind of things such as kind of source of funds checks before representing a client in a transaction, which in some cases may involve hundreds of thousands of pounds. Obviously, kind of source of funds is identifying how and where did the client get the money. Again, it's not enough to know that the funds are coming from a UK bank. As with a lot of kind of recent cases, involving UK banks, we know that not all banks are averse to accepting dirty money, but their failings are not an excuse for you not to perform your checks on how the funds came to be in your client's bank account. Okay, we know that firms regularly now have a source of funds form that they must require a new client to complete, providing copies of bank statements, pay slips, but there's obviously many that fail to check the funds being deposited with the law firm are actually from the same bank that they've provided checks on, let alone the same account that the client has provided as their source of funds. So how do you deal with funds being transferred from an individual's accountant or another law firm? And obviously these are all very important considerations. If you are subject to an SRA, NCA audit, are you confident you're able to provide evidence that those checks have been conducted? If you do find yourself being audited on AML compliance, you may find yourself in a situation where you're guilty until proven innocent, because unless you can provide evidence that you have conducted any checks and documented those, and where required, asked questions as to the source of funds and documented to the client's response, it is possible to assume that none of that actually took place. Okay, and then there is really kind of so much that falls into this kind of grey area, which is the client cooperative? What inquiries did you make? Is the client deliberately being evasive? Does the amount of funds match the client profile? Is there a satisfactory explanation for any differences? If it's an inheritance, do you have copies of the will or probate? How did the benefactor get access to the funds? Are the funds being discussed in accordance with what you would normally charge? Okay. Is it the right level of work that you as a firm would normally do? How long have you known the client? Is the work being carried out fit the profile of the client? Is any money involved in the transaction coming from a country deemed to be a high risk? So again, there is a whole bunch of a grey area, and the best thing that you can do is ask as many questions as you can. Okay, and obviously everything needs to be recorded as part of that customer due diligence, okay, including any customer documents that you've obtained. And now obviously keeping a comprehensive record allows you to be able to show that your business has complied with money laundering regulations. And this is obviously crucial to protect your business if there is an investigation into one of your customers. And my understanding is that those records need to be kept for 5 years, really kind of beginning from a date of a business relationship ends or the date a transaction is completed. Now, as well as doing your proper client due diligence for each transaction, you must also properly identify and check the suitability of your employees and supervise their work. You need to make sure that your business has adequate internal records, controls and monitoring systems, and these should alert you if criminals try to use your business for money laundering. So once you've been made aware of a potential threat internally, you can then try and take steps to prevent it and also report any suspicious activity. And those kind of, your internal controls should include things like appointing a nominated officer and making sure that employees know how to report any suspicious activity. Okay, appointing a compliance officer, identifying the responsibilities of senior managers on, on actions, training relevant employees on your AML responsibilities, and also again come back to documenting and updating your AML policies, controls and procedures. Okay, now you'll also need to complete a policy statement for your business. Okay, and again for that, that needs to list not only your AML policy, but obviously the controls and procedures your business will take to prevent any money laundering. So being a kind of proactive, so not only in terms of how you respond to any potential threats, but also how are you proactively in kind of preventing this in your business. And that kind of the document provides a framework for how your business will deal with the threat of money laundering. So you should name any relevant individuals and set out everybody's responsibilities in that. So even if your business is small, it's a useful tool for focusing your mind and those of your employees, again, if you have them. If you are suspicious that you are being asked to be party to a suspicious transaction, what should you do? Okay, and I think the first clear thing is to report that to the SRA and any other appropriate law enforcement, whether that be the police or the NCA, any concerns that you have about someone carrying out work which you know or suspect might be linked to fraudulent activity. Okay, now there is a recommendation in the SRA legislation that if you have suspicions about a transaction and that you take precautions not to jeopardize any actions by law enforcement by tipping the client off either directly or inadvertently, and not to proceed any grounds unless you have been given something called defense against ML. Okay, now I guess that's kind of enough of me talking. I'm going to bring in my colleague Andy at this point to kind of really show us, I guess, kind of what role technology has to play, and he's going to kind of show us how you conduct ID and AML checks through Insight using Verify, which is our integration partner. Andy, I guess, kind of thanks for being patient here. Over to you.
Thank you, Josh. Perfect. Okay, so everyone, there's lots of names in the participants I don't recognize, so thanks for your time. Okay, really grateful. Just going to share my screen. Okay, so everyone, all I have to do today, very straightforward, is just show you the actual act of ordering an ID AML search through Insight. Like Josh says, this is provided by Verify, they're one of our integration partners. Verify use LexisNexis's data source. So it is effectively identical to a LexisNexis search, right? I'm sure many people have heard of before. Verify isn't a sort of a new player, but I appreciate they're not as big as LexisNexis. They do the same thing. That's the most important thing to know. So anyone who hasn't seen Insight before, right, I appreciate, which is most of you, where we are now, I'm in the cases area of Insight, and we're in the client maintenance zone to start off with. So this is where you can create a client. It's also where you can maintain an existing client. All I've done so far, so I've just found a client that I've created in the past. You can see all of the details that you choose to record for them, whether it's at absolute sort of inception of the data, a week later, a year later, you can always add and maintain this data, right? And you can see I've got their details, addresses, methods of contact, and I've also recorded just an internal conflict check. So Insight has already looked within the database for other clients, contacts, staff, if there's any matter kind of matching detail. So that's all here as well. But what we're here for is the ID AML area. So when it comes to ordering a search through Insight, top of the ribbon, you've got this icon that reads perform check. The ID AML check box will pop up. From here, you select the service that you wish to see. All of the detail that you've given Insight will pre-populate the boxes, right? So person, I import the address, takes that through. The communication methods, I import those, it pulls that data through. If you'd like to do an identity check, you can input this information, right? It's not a requirement, but the more you give it, ultimately, the more it will do. Within summary, it may or may not give you some messages, what's required, what is not being performed. If there's not agenda, you can see I can just go back, fill that in, and that prompt disappears. Now, when you hit submit check, I'm not going to hit that today because it takes 20, 30 seconds to think about it. When you hit submit check, what that'll do, it will keep forever within this screen here a record of the document and whether it's a very quick, obvious pass or fail. When you want to view that document, click view and open the PDF. Insight will then open up the verified certificate, recording everything that it was able to verify and whether it was a pass or fail. Right? And that will be kept here forever. You can also prepare ID AML checks for contacts. So just to show you where I am, I'm still within cases. We were talking about client. I'm within contact now. So a contact is anyone perhaps you've spoken to that has not yet become or may not become a client of yours. You can also perform ID AML checks on a contact, right? Same information you can see, import that data. If this contact ever progresses to be a client, you can make them a client, right? And the ID AML check will also forever be stored within the client record. The final place you can see this, and it's just for convenience, because some people, some members of staff may not be able to create clients, right? They may not be able to order ID AML checks. That's a permission that you guys define what members of staff can do this. Everyone will always be able to see those checks, right? And that's done within cases and case inquiry. This is where you really work on Insight. And I'd be more than happy to show this to anyone if they wanted a demo. Within the case inquiry screen, you have your ledger and access to the workflows and everything else like that, but I won't talk about that today. At the very bottom of the screen, there's a tab that reads matter files. This is the correspondence hub of any bit of documentation that's ever gone through the matter. What you also have are the client matter files, and this is where you'll also, every single member of staff will be able to see those certificates. Should you choose to record anything else, and there's lots to this again that we can discuss perhaps. Should you want to keep a record of their passport, a copy of their utility bill, all of that can be kept here as well. Josh was saying about AML procedures, something that I won't talk about now. We may do a future webinar on is how the workflows within Insight could absolutely build some kind of AML procedure. And you could have a pre-built, defined, low, medium, high risk workflow, where dependent on the workflow, you ask different questions and you go into much more detail, but that's another conversation. That really, everyone, is all there is to it. It's very straightforward, very easy to train on, support on, get set up. Yeah, that's all.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. I was going to say, I guess I think one thing, it's great kind of having all of these kind of, I guess, features available, but again, how do you ensure that people have completed them? And again, I think you kind of touched upon that with having some kind of client onboarding process, like a workflow, which automatically has its own audit trail, so you can see exactly who's carried out those checks. And again, with any documents here, they actually sit on the client file and are essentially kind of accessible to anybody who goes into Insight. So regardless of how many matters you will have with that particular client, that trail of documents will essentially be on every one of those matters, right?
Absolutely, Josh. Yeah, yeah. So the workflow history. So I was just there's a Q&A. So the workflow history will always be kept there. So if you'd like to see who did what when, right, who recorded that, who attached the document, and all of the documents, anything at all, will always live within the matter files.
Excellent. I'll take it you'll pick up that message from Neil and follow up accordingly.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Right, I'm gonna take back control of the screen. Okay, excellent. So really kind of what I want to kind of cover off here is really, so what is the goal of any effective AML process? Well, I guess kind of it should be to ensure that everyone in the firm responsible for onboarding new clients is aware of the risks, okay, and that all relevant checks are carried out, processes followed, and supporting documents are accessible by all who need access to them, okay, as opposed to kind of sitting on a desktop somewhere, and an auditable trail exists containing records of any communication and evidence supplied, okay. And you'll also need to ensure that records are updated and maintained, and there are no assumptions that if someone has been a client for several years, that certain checks can be circumnavigated. Like we've talked about earlier, criminals have been kind of well known to infiltrate law firms, build trust relationships with law firm staff with the intention of carrying out money laundering. It also needs to be efficient. We know that technology platforms like Verify can return result checks certainly back in a matter of seconds. I think you kind of talked about kind of 20 or 30 seconds there, and files stored on the case and client file, as opposed to the traditional way of collecting, scanning documentation and manually filing documents where nobody else can see them on a shelf or on somebody's desktop. Okay, fee earners know more than anyone else that time is money, and money is time in this business. Okay, and you really kind of reduce risk by ensuring that regardless of who is completing the checks, that the correct process is followed, and anyone can see what checks have been completed and by whom. So essentially you have an auditable trail there, and really that's coming back to the role of technology, and also the ability to reassign tasks where someone is on leave or on holiday, to ensure that nothing falls through the cracks. And again, with automation, you can standardize and optimize this process to ensure that every check is submitted with all the right information every time. And imagine how much time could be saved when the involved parties don't have to be tracked down and followed up for missing bits of information. And there are no mistakes made when manually inputting data or copying and pasting it from one system to another. Okay, and should you find yourself under audit, that your processes are irrefutable, and so you can potentially save yourself from a lengthy and potentially expensive and sometimes ultimately damning investigation. Okay, right. Annie, I know we're a little bit kind of over time, but we've got time for a few questions. I've got one here that I've picked up whilst you were talking, and that is there an extra cost for AML checks in Insight Legal? Now, I can't off the top of my head tell whether this is an existing enterprise customer, but let's assume it is. Do you know what the costs for the Verify integration are?
So the costs on verify.com/pricing on their website, an ID AML is £5 plus VAT.
Okay.
I have known Verify to sort of budge on those. That's a conversation that you would have with them.
Okay, fine. And again, you're not restricted to using Verify if you are an Insight Legal customer. We have lots of clients who use other platforms. I guess we've chosen to partner with Verify because they're, I think that they hold kind of similar values to us as a company, but obviously what Verify allows you to do is to link information from the case management system directly into the checks. Okay. Another question I have here is, do AML checks leave a footprint on the client file? Okay, and I'm guessing kind of, if you're talking about client file, yes, within Insight, you'll see, I think Andy showed you, there is a essentially kind of a copy of the document that's stored in the file with a date and timestamp for when the AML check is carried out. If you are talking about on the client's credit file, I think I'm certainly sure, because I've had this question at least kind of maybe once before. If you are simply just doing an ID check, it doesn't leave a footprint on the client's credit file. But I'm a bit unsure if it does if you're doing an ID and AML check. Okay, but that's something I'm happy to take away as an outstanding question. And did you have any other quick questions that we've picked up?
No, Josh, no, all good, thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Just in terms of, I guess, kind of final things. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sharing a copy of the video recording, so please keep an eye out for that email, which will include a link to the video recording. Anyone watching this as a live session or a recording, and you'd like a demo of Insight Legal or any of the features in Insight Legal, including our kind of integration with AML checks, or you want to understand how to put together a process for onboarding new clients, then please feel free to reach out directly to Andy, myself, or use the webinars at insightlegal.co.uk email address that you see on the screen in front of you. Okay, our next webinar will be looking at payment links. We don't yet have a date for that, or date or time for that, or a page to register, but please keep an eye out for the email that will go out with that. I think we're looking at probably kind of the first week of September, hopefully when everybody's back from their summer holidays and the kids are packed off back to school. Okay, I want to thank everyone, including Andy, my fellow panelist, for your participating in this webinar today. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah.